The late August sun beat down on the corrugated metal roof of the dilapidated shack, a heat that felt less like warmth and more like an oppressive blanket. Inside, Marcus Thorne, a man whose ambition often outweighed his common sense, meticulously wiped the lens of his expensive camera. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildewed wood, a stark contrast to the air-conditioned editing suite he had left behind in New York City. Marcus was 32, a documentary filmmaker with a modest reputation built on exposing forgotten American histories, the kind that lurked in the shadows of folklore and police blotters. His latest obsession, the reason he was sweating profusely in the middle of nowhere, was the Grimsby family. The official files were thin, a series of unexplained disappearances in the deep woods of rural West Virginia around 1898, culminating in a vague, unsettling account of cannibalism and inbreeding before the family seemingly vanished. Local historians dismissed it as a sensationalized frontier myth, but Marcus saw the gaps, the cold case potential. "We're running low on memory cards, Marcus. Are you sure you need 3 more takes of that rusted axe head?" Chloe Vance, Marcus's seasoned sound engineer and the anchor to his sometimes reckless drive, adjusted her headphones. She was practical, always watching the clock and the budget. Yet her expression held a sliver of the same fascination that gripped him. "Chloe, this isn't just an axe. It's a prop in a legend," Marcus countered, adjusting the focus. "This shed, this isolated farm, it's the last known residence. Every texture, every shadow tells a story of scarcity, of desperation. We have to immerse the viewer. The key to psychological terror is grounding it in gritty reality." They were miles from the nearest paved road, their rental SUV parked precariously down a long, overgrown dirt track. The silence here was different. It wasn't peaceful. It felt expectant, heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Marcus was attempting to connect the 1898 disappearances to a series of unsolved missing persons cases that had plagued the area intermittently over the past 50 years. A pattern the local sheriff's department had consistently attributed to hikers getting lost or simple runaways. His working hypothesis, the one that excited him and troubled Chloe, was that the Grimsby line hadn't been eradicated in 1898. They had simply learned to hide better. "I pulled up the last recorded weather data for the area in the late 1890s, Chloe said, checking her phone for a signal that was frustratingly weak. The winter of '98 was brutal. Record snowfalls. It makes sense that if they were isolated, the psychological pressure would have been immense. It's a recipe for breakdown, not just some ghost story." Marcus nodded, his focus shifting to a dark, narrow well outside the shed. The stone lip was crumbling, covered in moss. "Desperate times, Chloe. And when people are desperate, they do desperate things. No ghosts, no magic, just human hunger, social isolation, and the terrifying logic of survival." He started the camera recording, his voice dropping into the low, measured cadence he used for his on-camera narrations. For over a century, the legend of the Grimsby family has been confined to hushed whispers and poorly documented police files. A tale of remote settlement, scarcity, and a descent into unthinkable acts. But what if the story didn't end with a burned-out cabin and a few scattered bones? What if the isolation that bred their original pathology also became the perfect camouflage for their descendants? As Marcus spoke, he circled the well, a low-angle shot focusing on the murky, impenetrable darkness within. The camera caught the anxious flicker in Chloe's eyes as she monitored the sound levels. Suddenly, a faint, metallic clink echoed from the woods nearby. It was sharp, out of place, breaking the heavy silence. Marcus stopped speaking immediately, his professional facade cracking into genuine alarm. "Did you get that?" he whispered, lowering the camera. Chloe's eyes darted toward the tree line, her hand instinctively going to the small canister of pepper spray clipped to her belt. Sound pickup was clean, definitely metal on stone. "A car engine, maybe?" "No road nearby," Marcus stated, the blood draining slightly from his face. If it was a car, we would have heard it coming up the track. That was close. The light was fading quickly, turning the forest into a mass of deepening shadows. Marcus felt a knot of pure, cold dread tighten in his stomach. This was the moment where the academic fascination collided with the primal instinct to flee. He had come here looking for a mystery to solve. Now he felt like he was being watched, like he had just become part of someone else's unfinished story. "Pack it up, Chloe, now. We're done for the day." His voice was low and urgent. "We'll review the footage tonight at the motel." As they hurried to load their equipment, the sense of being observed intensified. Marcus glanced back at the abandoned shack, the well, and the darkening woods. The thrill of the hunt had abruptly been replaced by the chilling reality of being hunted. The legend, he realized with a sickening lurch, might not be a history lesson. It might be a warning. If you're captivated by this blend of real-world investigation and psychological terror, don't let the mystery end here. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this terrifying story. The drive back to the closest town, Fairfax, was tense. The silence inside the SUV broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires and the hurried breaths of Marcus Thorne and Chloe Vance. They had managed to pack their essential gear into the vehicle in less than 5 minutes, the metallic clink from the woods having acted like a gunshot starting a frantic race. "We heard something, Chloe." "We both heard it," Marcus repeated, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He needed confirmation, an anchor to reality. "I know, Marcus. It sounded like an iron gate, maybe, or a latch. But let's keep the theories locked down until we've reviewed the footage and the audio," Chloe replied, trying to project a calmness she didn't feel. Her eyes kept flickering to the rearview mirror, checking for headlights that never appeared. The isolation that had been a documentary backdrop was now a cage. They reached the dingy, brightly lit motel, the kind of place where the air conditioning smelled like old cigarettes and regret, just as darkness fully descended. Instead of unpacking, they immediately set up their laptop and high-fidelity headphones. Marcus cued the audio file from the moment they stopped talking. The air was dead silent for several seconds. Then, distinct and chillingly close, came the sound. Clink, clink. Not random, but deliberate, followed by the soft, rhythmic scrape of something being dragged across dirt. "That's not a hiker. That's not an animal," Marcus stated, his voice low. "It sounds heavy. And whatever it is, it was moving towards the shack, not away." "Okay, so someone's out there. Maybe a squatter. Maybe a local who doesn't like a couple of city folk poking around their history," Chloe suggested, the rational explanation sounding flimsy even to her. "Or maybe, Chloe, it's a descendant protecting their property, their secret," Marcus countered, pulling out a laminated copy of a detailed 1890s topographical survey he'd found in the county archives. It was the only existing map that predated the establishment of the surrounding national forest boundaries. He spread the map across the desk. The area of the Grimsby shack was marked with a faded X. More interesting, however, was a faint dotted line leading west from the shack, winding deep into an unmapped valley known locally as the Hollow. "Look at this. The official records from 1898 mention a patrol searching the immediate vicinity of the farm after the initial report. But look at this line." Marcus traced the dotted path with his finger. "It shows an old logging trail, maybe even a game path leading to a deep cut in the hills. This trail isn't on any modern map, and it wasn't searched back then." Chloe leaned closer, her skepticism battling her innate curiosity. "It's a pencil mark on an old map, Marcus. It could be nothing. Or it could be the escape route," he insisted. The Grimsbys were known to be trappers and hermits. They wouldn't have stayed within a mile of the official residence if they knew a search was coming. They would have gone deep. They would have gone to the hardest-to-reach place possible. Marcus pulled up the digital files from his research, the intermittent missing persons cases from the area. 1953, a traveling salesman disappears. 1978, a teenage couple camping. 1999, a forest ranger on patrol. In every case, the bodies were never found. The local consensus was that the wilderness consumed them. "We're looking for a logistical solution to a survival problem," Marcus said, pacing the small room. "How do you sustain a family line for over a century in total isolation, with no resources? You don't, not unless you adopt a different economy." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication of the Grimsby's macabre legend hung heavy in the air. They need supplies, they need food, and they need to remain invisible, Chloe whispered, running a cold hand across her arm. "If that trail leads to a hidden settlement, how do they keep it stocked without ever being seen?" Marcus pointed to the 1890s trail on the map. "The hollow is surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides, but on the 4th, there's an almost sheer drop into the river gorge. Back then, it would have been impenetrable. But now, look." He pulled up a modern satellite image. A small private logging road was punched through the southern forest 20 years ago. It's barely used. It provides access. The supply route. A slow, terrifying realization dawned on him. The disappearances weren't random acts of violence driven by hunger. They were calculated removals, people who strayed too close to their access points or were chosen for their isolation. "We have to follow that trail. We have to see what's at the end of that 1898 path," Marcus declared, his voice firm with a renewed, dangerous resolve. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by the overwhelming drive to uncover the truth. The story was no longer a legend. It was a living, breathing, horrifying secret. Chloe's face was pale, but she met his gaze. "Marcus, if we go in there, we stop being researchers and start being trespassers. And if your theory is right, we'll be walking into the middle of their home ground. We need help. And who are we going to call? The sheriff who calls this a myth? No. We have the map, Chloe. We have the sound. We have the hypothesis. We go in smart, and we go in tomorrow." He folded the old map, the crease lines a roadmap to potential disaster. The psychological weight of what they might find was beginning to crush the air out of the room. The next morning, under a sky that looked heavy and indifferent, Marcus and Chloe drove their SUV to the start of the old Grimsby Trail. They left their cell phones and wallets in a securely locked box hidden under the back seat, minimizing what could identify them if things went wrong. They carried only their professional camera and audio equipment, a basic first aid kit, and 2 cans of bear spray. The trailhead was exactly where the 1890s map indicated, a barely visible gap in the foliage, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. As they stepped onto the narrow path, the dense canopy immediately swallowed the daylight, plunging them into a cool, perpetual twilight. Marcus led the way, relying on a compass and his instinct, constantly checking the old map against the terrain. The path was rough, tangled with roots, and often crisscrossed with game trails, making navigation a tense, slow process. Every few feet, they had to push aside thick, wet brush that slapped against their faces. "Smell that?" Chloe whispered, her voice tight. The air had taken on a peculiar scent. Not simply forest decay, but something earthy, slightly metallic, and profoundly unsettling. It reminded Marcus vaguely of a slaughterhouse he had once filmed for an unrelated project. A mix of blood and fear. They moved for nearly 3 hours, the silence of the deep woods unnerving. Marcus kept his senses heightened, his eyes scanning for any sign of human modification. A cut branch, a discarded wrapper, anything that would confirm his hypothesis. Then he saw it. Embedded in the mud, partially washed away by a recent rain, was the faint, unmistakable tread of a modern rubber boot. Not a hiking boot, but something heavier, industrial, the kind of tread used by workers in harsh, wet conditions. "Look," Marcus pointed, crouching low. "That's recent, maybe a day or 2 old." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. "They're using this path. They're active." As they continued, the trail started to descend sharply, the ground becoming rockier. They were nearing the hollow. Marcus checked the map again. According to the satellite data he'd reviewed, they were now approaching the boundary of the isolated valley. Suddenly, Chloe stopped dead, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. She pointed to a small, almost imperceptible detail near the base of an ancient oak tree. It was a piece of faded, tattered fabric, snagged on a thorn. It looked like a fragment of an old shirt, washed out by years of rain. Marcus gently pried it loose with a stick. It was stiff, almost brittle, and stained with a dark, reddish-brown color. "It's old, but look at this seam," Chloe said, pointing to a thick, crude stitch. Homemade. Primitive. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He quickly bagged the fragment, a chilling piece of non-supernatural evidence. The reality of their situation was becoming undeniable. They were not just on an abandoned path. They were on the entry route to a place where people lived outside the boundaries of civilization and sanity. A few minutes later, the dense forest opened up abruptly. They found themselves on a steep ledge overlooking a hidden valley. The Hollow. It was exactly as Marcus had theorized, but far more unsettling. Below them was a small, crudely maintained collection of structures. Not the picturesque, rustic charm of a remote homestead, but a cluster of dark, low-slung shacks and storage buildings, seemingly grown from the earth itself. They were built from scavenged and weathered wood, roofed with mismatched tin, and surrounded by a high, reinforced fence made of rough-hewn logs. There were no windows visible, only heavy wooden doors. Smoke curled from a single, thick metal chimney. It was a settlement built for absolute concealment and defense, a place designed to keep the outside world out and whatever was inside, in. "My God, Marcus," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's real. The Grimsbys. They're down there." As they watched, a figure emerged from one of the shacks. It was a man, tall and unnaturally thin, wearing drab, patched clothing that seemed to melt into the environment. He moved with a strange, shuffling gait, his head low, as if unused to looking up. He carried a heavy, crude bucket, which he emptied into a shallow, fenced-off pit before disappearing back inside the shack. Marcus raised his camera, his hands trembling slightly, and began filming the valley from their concealed vantage point. The sight of the man confirmed the historical accounts. The isolation had taken its toll, physically and psychologically. This was no normal community. It was a closed system, a terrifying, evolutionary dead end. "We get a few minutes of clear footage and we leave," Marcus commanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and triumphant professional validation. "We do not go down there. We get the evidence and we call the police from a safe distance." As he finished speaking, the thin man reappeared. This time he didn't head back into the shack. He stopped, his movements ceasing completely. He slowly raised his head, and despite the distance, Marcus felt the profound, chilling impact of the man's gaze. The man was looking directly at their position on the ridge. He couldn't possibly have heard them. They had been completely silent. But something about the way the wind shifted or a glint of sun on the camera lens must have given them away. The man just stood there, unmoving, watching their small pocket of trees. Marcus froze. The fear now was palpable, a suffocating presence. They weren't observers anymore, they were discovered. The moment the man's head snapped up and his eyes locked onto their position, Marcus and Chloe dropped flat onto the forest floor. The brittle leaves and twigs beneath them crackled, every tiny sound amplified in the sudden, agonizing silence. "Did he see us?" Chloe breathed, her face pressed into the damp earth. "I don't know. Don't move. Don't make a sound," Marcus whispered, his heart hammering against his chest. He could feel the blood pulsing in his ears, drowning out the noises of the forest. He strained to hear any movement from the valley below. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus slowly, cautiously, raised his head just enough to see over the ledge. The thin man was gone. The entrance to the shack, a dark, heavy wooden door, was closed. The settlement looked inert, silent, a perfect image of pastoral obscurity. "He's gone back inside," Marcus murmured, lowering himself again. "But he saw something. He knows we're up here." "Then we need to get out now," Chloe urged, scrambling into a crouch. "The evidence is enough, Marcus. We have what we need to prove the settlement exists." They turned to flee back up the trail, but stopped short. About 50 feet behind them, blocking the narrow path, a dense, freshly cut tree branch lay across their only escape route. It was a deliberate obstruction, too thick for them to simply step over or drag away quickly. They hadn't heard anyone approach. The woods were too quiet, too dense. The realization hit Marcus with the cold shock of an ice bath. The figure they had seen in the valley was a lookout, and their position was now compromised. Someone else, someone equally silent and effective, had circled around while they were focused on the valley. "We're cut off," Marcus whispered, looking around desperately. The woods here were impossibly thick, a chaotic tangle of thorn bushes, vines, and sharp rocks. Trying to bushwhack through it would be noisy, slow, and probably result in serious injury. "We have to go around. Up the ridge," Chloe suggested, pointing to a steeper, rock-strewn section that seemed less choked with undergrowth. "It's rough, but it avoids the trail. We might be able to circle back." They scrambled up the loose earth of the ridge. The vertical climb was exhausting and loud. They were essentially climbing a cliff face, grabbing at roots and jagged stones. As they ascended, a deep, unsettling sound drifted up from below, a low, guttural baying like a pack of hunting dogs, but rougher, more human. It wasn't a call. It was a warning, a sound designed to terrify and disorient. The psychological impact was instantaneous. Marcus felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with pure panic. They were not dealing with a few isolated individuals. They were dealing with a group that had a coordinated, effective method of tracking and trapping. They reached the top of the ridge, breathless, scraped, and terrified. They had gained altitude, but they were still deep in hostile territory. Marcus checked his map. If they kept moving east, they would eventually hit the boundary of the national forest, where the terrain leveled out and might provide a chance to hide or run. "East. Follow the compass. Don't look back," Marcus commanded, grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her forward. They ran for a few desperate minutes, stumbling over hidden roots, the sounds of the pursuit growing closer. The baying was interspersed now with sharp, snapping sounds, branches breaking, the unmistakable sound of heavy feet on the forest floor. Then they heard a second sound, even more chilling, the low, urgent tap-tap-tap of something being struck with a rock, a primitive, non-verbal form of communication passing through the dense trees, a coordinate being called out. Marcus looked frantically ahead. The forest was too open here. They were exposed. He spotted a shallow crevice between two large boulders, partially obscured by an overgrown cedar bush. "In there! Quick!" They squeezed into the cramped space, pulling the cedar branches around them. The crevice smelled damp and ancient. They huddled together, hearts pounding, listening to the woods come alive around them. The sounds of the pursuit intensified. They could hear the heavy, uneven footsteps approaching their hiding spot, the rustling of leaves just yards away. Then the rhythmic tapping started again, right overhead. A figure emerged from the trees, moving with the same silent efficiency that had blocked their path. It was another man, older, with a severe, weathered face. He wasn't looking for them randomly. He was following the acoustic cues. He stopped directly beside the cedar bush, his back to them, and began examining the ground. Marcus and Chloe were so close they could hear the man's labored breathing. His hand reached down and picked up a broken twig, tossing it aside with an air of cold certainty. He was a tracker, and they were his prey. The man turned his head slightly, his eyes sweeping over the ground near the boulders. Marcus held his breath, expecting the man to reach out, push the branches aside, and end their desperate flight. The psychological pressure of being inches from discovery, unable to move, was a form of torture. Just as the man's gaze seemed to linger on their hiding spot, a distant, sharp whistle, a single high-pitched note, cut through the air. The man froze. Then, without a glance toward the crevice, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest, moving in the direction of the whistle. They were safe, for now. But the whistle was a chilling reminder. They were dealing with a network, an organization. The hunt had been called off, but only temporarily. They were alive, but they were lost, hunted, and now knew that the true terror of the Grimsby legend was the calculated, intelligent humanity of their pursuers. They waited in the crevice for another hour after the pursuit sounds had faded into the distant woods. The adrenaline rush had subsided, leaving them weak and shivering despite the mild temperature. The physical exhaustion was compounded by the psychological trauma of the close call. "We can't go back to the car. They'll be watching the trail," Chloe whispered, her voice rough. She pulled out the water bottle and took a tentative sip, her hands shaking. Marcus checked the compass. "We keep going east. We have to hit that new logging road. It's our best chance for a clear path out, and maybe, just maybe, we can flag down a truck." They emerged from the crevice and began a slower, more cautious trek through the woods. The terrain eventually began to flatten out, a sign that they were reaching the edge of the dense, isolated region. The atmosphere changed. The woods became less tangled, the trees older and more uniform, typical of commercial timberland. After another grueling hour, they stumbled onto a wide gravel service road, the private logging access Marcus had seen on the satellite image. It was rough, unused and overgrown in the middle, but it was salvation. They walked quickly, the open space feeling both a blessing and a new vulnerability. They kept close to the tree line, scanning both directions, their nerves frayed to breaking point. "Marcus, stop," Chloe said suddenly, pointing. About 100 yards ahead, resting just off the side of the logging road, was an object that looked completely out of place, a large, heavily camouflaged storage container, the kind used for shipping. It was painted a drab, military green and carefully obscured by piled brush and old tarps. It looked like it hadn't moved in years. "What is that?" Marcus murmured, automatically raising his camera to film it from a distance. "Too big for a hunting blind. Too secure for simple storage," Chloe observed. "Look at the lock. It's industrial grade. Something valuable is in there, or something they want to keep hidden at all costs." Driven by their mission and a desperate need to find anything that could help them, they crept towards the container. The lock was enormous, but Marcus noticed something even more disturbing: fresh, shallow scrapes on the ground leading away from the container, as if something heavy had recently been dragged out and then back in. "This is it, Chloe. The access point. The supply point," Marcus said, his voice husky. He reached out and touched the cold, metallic side of the container. It was slightly recessed into the ground, a subtle attempt at burial that confirmed its long-term purpose. Suddenly, Chloe's sharp eye caught another detail. On the ground near the base, half buried under a patch of moss, was a small plastic medical waste container, the kind used for discarded needles or contaminated bandages. She didn't touch it, but simply filmed it with the camera. Medical supplies. Where are they getting medical supplies? They can't go to a doctor. If they are inbred, they would have health issues, right? And if they have health issues, they have to treat them. Marcus realized. Someone is supplying them, someone on the outside. The mystery had just deepened, evolving from an isolated cult to a network of active concealment. The Grimsbys weren't just hermits, they had an accomplice in the modern world. Marcus's attention was drawn to a faint, almost invisible track leading from the container into the thick undergrowth. A service path, narrow but clearly used, leading deeper into the woods toward where they knew the hollow lay. This is the route. The logging road is their distribution hub. The supply path is how they get it into the valley, Marcus reasoned, filming the coordinates of the container. We have to follow that path. We need proof of their connection to the outside world. No, Marcus, we have the footage of the settlement. We have the lock, the camouflage, the medical waste. That's enough for a warrant. We need to get out and call the authorities, the federal authorities, now that we know there's a supply chain. Chloe pleaded, grabbing his arm. Marcus hesitated, the weight of her logic pressing down on his recklessness. But the filmmaker in him, the man driven by the need for the irrefutable closing piece of evidence, overruled the instinct for self-preservation. If we leave now, they'll move this. They'll cover the tracks. We need to find the point of transfer, he insisted, pulling away. Just 100 yards, Chloe. just far enough down the service path to find definitive proof of the exchange. He stepped onto the narrow trail, the camera rolling. The woods were darker here, the air heavy and still. He walked only about 30 feet before he stopped, a cold, sickening chill replacing the earlier fear. Tacked crudely onto a tree at chest height was a small, hand-drawn sign facing the direction of the logging road. The sign was made of weathered wood, and the message was carved deeply, crudely, into the surface. Go home. We know what you're looking for. It's already been delivered. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a terrifying statement of total awareness. They knew they were being watched, they knew their mission, and they were communicating not through violence, but through a cold, calculated display of control. The message implied the delivery wasn't food or medicine, but something else entirely, perhaps information, perhaps even a warning about the investigators themselves. Before Marcus could even process the chilling words, he heard a sound on the logging road behind them. The low, heavy rumble of a diesel engine, approaching slowly. They had been played. The container was a lure, and the moment they went off the road to investigate, their presence was broadcast. The outside accomplice had arrived. Marcus and Chloe plunged immediately into the woods, desperately trying to get as far away from the service path and the logging road as possible. The heavy, low-frequency rumble of the diesel engine grew louder, confirming their worst fears. They were trapped between the hidden Grimsby settlement and a modern collaborator. They ran in a zigzag pattern, trying to avoid leaving a clear trail, pushing through thickets of blackberry bushes that tore at their skin and clothes. The truck stopped with a hiss of air brakes, the sound agonizingly close. They flattened themselves behind a huge, fallen redwood log, their breathing ragged. The air was now filled with the sound of a truck door opening and closing, followed by heavy, measured footsteps crunching on the gravel. Marcus slowly raised the camera, using the log as cover. He zoomed in, trying to focus on the figure. The man who had driven the truck was ordinary, which made him terrifying. He was middle-aged, stocky, wearing a clean blue-collar uniform, the kind worn by delivery drivers or utility workers. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, obscuring his face. He looked like any anonymous service provider. He carried a large black duffel bag and a couple of sealed plastic bins, the kind used for catering or sterile equipment. He moved with a practiced, efficient pace, placing the bins and the bag by the storage container. He then looked directly toward the dense woods where Marcus and Chloe were hiding. He didn't make a sound, didn't call out. He just stood there, his posture relaxed, yet radiating a cold, unnerving patience. He was waiting. He knew they were close. He's waiting for them to pick it up, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. No, he's waiting for us to make a move, Marcus countered. The ordinary appearance of the man was a facade. He was a professional, likely armed, and definitely aware of their presence. The accomplice reached into the truck cab and pulled out a small metallic object, which he placed carefully on the ground. It was a wildlife camera, the kind used by hunters to track game, mounted on a tiny tripod. He adjusted the angle, pointing it directly into the woods where they had entered the service path. He was not just resupplying the Grimsbys, he was securing the perimeter and gathering intelligence on the intruders. After a few more moments of unnerving silence, the accomplice pulled out his phone. He typed a message, his thumb moving quickly. He then placed the phone on the truck's dashboard. He wasn't making a call. He was initiating a delayed communication, a cold, anonymous message to his employers. Marcus realized their mistake. They had been filming the Grimsbys, but the Grimsbys and their accomplice were filming them. Their entire journey had been tracked. The accomplice then did something unexpected. He took a small, bright red can from his pocket, walked a few feet into the woods near the camera, and sprayed a quick, concentrated burst onto the bark of a tree. It was a visual marker, a clear signpost for the trackers. Satisfied, he climbed back into his truck and, without another glance at the woods, drove slowly back down the logging road, his diesel engine disappearing into the distance. He marked our entry point, Chloe gasped. "They know exactly where we went into the woods. And they know what we look like. They'll have our faces on that wildlife camera footage," Marcus said, lowering the camera with a heavy sigh. The game had just shifted. They weren't hunting a historical anomaly. They were fighting a modern, organized operation that was now hunting them. They had to take the risk. Marcus sprinted silently to the tree the accomplice had marked. He quickly reached out and scraped the red substance off the bark with the blade of his pocket knife, smearing the bright pigment into the surrounding dirt. He then snatched the wildlife camera, tucking the small device into his pocket. A risky move, but a necessary piece of counter-evidence. They had bought themselves a precious few minutes, but the pressure was immense. The Grimsbys were likely already on the move, alerted by the accomplice's communication. Marcus looked back toward the storage container, its camouflage suddenly looking incredibly menacing. The bins contained food, medicine, and who knew what else. The necessities for maintaining a hidden, inbred community in the 21st century. They knew they couldn't stay on the logging road. The only path left was to keep moving east, deep into the heart of the national forest, hoping to reach a major trail or miraculously find a ranger station. Their survival now depended on their speed, their ability to navigate without light, and their understanding that they were being pursued by people who knew the land intimately. They turned and ran, the silent woods now echoing with the sound of their own desperate footsteps. The next several hours were a blur of desperate, silent movement. Marcus and Chloe pushed themselves to the limit, navigating the rugged terrain of the national forest boundary. They moved off-trail, parallel to the general direction of the logging road, keeping the compass fixed on an easterly path. They ate the last of their meager rations and drank the last of their water. As night fell, the air turned cold and damp. They knew the Grimsbys would have an advantage in the dark, their movements silent, their eyes accustomed to the forest's low light. They found a temporary hiding spot under the root system of a massive, upturned tree, a small, protected hollow that offered decent concealment. They huddled together, exhausted, the adrenaline having drained away to be replaced by a chilling realization of their vulnerability. "We have to review the footage," Marcus whispered, pulling out the laptop. "We need to know what the accomplice sent them, if anything." He quickly connected the stolen wildlife camera to the laptop. The camera was basic, focused only on movement detection, and it stored images on a small internal card. Marcus scrolled through the recent captures. Most were photos of deer and squirrels. Then, the recent captures began. The first image was of the truck pulling up. The next was of the accomplice setting up the camera. The third was a clear, unblinking shot of Marcus and Chloe emerging from the woods to investigate the red spray, their faces caught in a moment of frantic activity. The camera had captured their identities and their location. The accomplice's job was to confirm who the intruders were, and he had succeeded. Chloe stared at the image of herself, the terror in her eyes perfectly captured by the cold lens. "He was waiting for us. The whole thing was a calculated move. They lured us in to get a clean shot. They're not primitive killers, Chloe. They're highly intelligent operators who have spent decades perfecting their trade," Marcus said, the terror giving way to a cold, analytical resolve. "They use technology to stay hidden and to eliminate threats." He scrolled further down the camera's memory. There was one more image, time-stamped just before the accomplice drove away. It was a close-up photo of the hand-drawn sign they had found. "Go home. We know what you're looking for. It's already been delivered." But this time, the camera caught a detail they had missed in their panic. Underneath the main message, scrawled faintly in pencil, were two numbers, $10,000. "It's a transaction." The accomplice was paid $10,000 for the delivery, Marcus realized, a chilling certainty in his voice. This isn't just about survival. It's a business, a network of silence and concealment. They had to face the possibility that the delivery wasn't just supplies. It could have been information, a weapon, or even a human being, the latest victim of a crime that extended far beyond the Grimsby family itself. As Marcus processed the implication of the network, he felt a strange, damp draft of air against his neck. He looked around their makeshift shelter, a sense of profound unease settling over him. He shone his small pen light up into the roots above them. A piece of synthetic rope, thin but strong, was tied tightly around one of the largest roots and disappeared into the darkness above the tree. It was the color of mud, nearly invisible in the low light. He reached up, his fingers tracing the line of the rope. It wasn't a random piece of debris. It was taut. "Marcus, what is it?" Chloe whispered, sensing his alarm. "A tripwire," he said, his voice a low, strangled sound. "Or a perimeter marker. They didn't call off the hunt, they funneled us. They knew we'd seek cover. This whole area is a trap." As he finished the sentence, he heard a sound that turned his blood to ice. The sharp, metallic click of a latch, originating from the woods directly behind their root shelter. It was the same clink they had heard at the shack, only closer this time, and far more menacing. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed Chloe and pulled her out of the hollow, abandoning the laptop and the camera equipment. Their survival depended on speed and instinct, not evidence. They stumbled out into the cold night air, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Too late. A heavy reinforced net, made of thick, nearly invisible black rope, dropped down from the canopy, catching their ankles. They fell hard onto the ground, the net immediately tightening around them. The sound of footsteps, quick and deliberate, closed in from two directions. Two figures emerged from the shadows. They were tall, gaunt, and silent, wearing dark, crude clothing. They carried long, primitive-looking clubs, and their eyes, catching the faint starlight, held an unsettling, empty focus. Marcus struggled, pulling at the thick cord, but the net was expertly deployed and secured. He realized with a sickening lurch that the Grimsbys weren't just skilled trappers, they were masters of human capture, their methods refined over a century of isolated practice. "We're caught," Chloe gasped, tears of fear welling in her eyes. The two figures stood over them, silent, their faces expressionless, their movements predatory. The terror was no longer psychological. It was physical, concrete, and absolute. They were completely at the mercy of the Macabre legend. The full horror of the Hollow has been revealed, and Marcus and Chloe are now caught in the Grimsby's web. The final 3 chapters will uncover the identity of the accomplice and the dark secret of their modern business. Don't miss the climax of this terrifying story. Hit the subscribe button right now and join the community to watch the ending unfold. Marcus and Chloe were dragged, still entangled in the net, for a terrifying and painful half-hour. The Grimsby men were incredibly strong, moving with an animalistic endurance, pulling them back along the service path toward the Hollow. They were eventually deposited unceremoniously into a small, dark structure near the fence line of the settlement. The air inside was foul, smelling of unwashed bodies and damp earth. When the heavy wooden door slammed shut, they were plunged into absolute darkness. Marcus, quickly untangling himself, felt around the small enclosure. The walls were thick logs, the floor was packed dirt, and the only light came from a single narrow slot near the top of the door. They were in a holding cell, a primitive jail. "Are you hurt?" Marcus whispered, finding Chloe and steadying her. "Just scrapes. My legs twisted a little." "But Marcus, we're here. We're in the Hollow." Her voice was a fragile thread of sound. He needed to think, to find the logical loophole in their capture. "They didn't kill us. They wanted us alive. That's our advantage. Why keep them alive?" If the Grimsbys were simple, desperate cannibals, the threat would have been eliminated immediately. Their survival meant they were useful. Marcus pressed his ear to the wall, listening. He could hear the low, murmurous activity of the settlement. A child crying, the sound of wood being chopped, and a low, resonant voice. An older man, giving curt, clear instructions. He tried the door, but it was barred and locked from the outside. He then looked up at the narrow slot of light. It was just wide enough for them to see slivers of the courtyard. Through the slot, they could see the thin man who had been the lookout. He was now washing the black duffel bag and the plastic bins left by the accomplice. He worked methodically, using a stiff brush and water from a small cistern, ensuring no trace evidence of the external contact remained. Then, the older man emerged. He was the patriarch, a figure of profound authority. He was stockier than the others, his face heavily lined, his eyes cold and intelligent. He inspected the cleaning process with clinical detachment. "The risk was unnecessary, Elias," the older man said, his voice carrying clearly in the cool air, sounding surprisingly educated despite his appearance. The woman and the man were merely curious. "They are filmmakers, not law enforcement. The accomplice gave us their identities. They had no official authority." Elias, the lookout, scraped the last traces of mud from a bin. "They filmed the container, Father. They know our route. They had to be neutralized." The conversation was chilling in its banality. They spoke of capture and elimination as a simple matter of risk management. Marcus realized the terrifying truth. The Grimsbys were not mindless monsters. They were a highly functional, socially isolated entity operating under a set of cold, rational rules designed for long-term survival and secrecy. "Why didn't the accomplice finish them off, Father?" Elias asked. The older man, the father, looked toward the small prison. "Because the accomplice's role is extraction, not waste disposal. And these two are not waste. They are a resource." He turned and walked toward a different building, a larger structure that looked like the main communal area. Marcus and Chloe watched, horrified, as the father returned a minute later, pushing a simple wooden wheelbarrow. In the wheelbarrow, resting on a clean canvas, was a collection of personal belongings. Marcus's wallet, Chloe's purse, their cell phones and car keys. The father stopped outside their door. "We know who you are, Marcus Thorne. We know your vehicle's location and your destination in Fairfax. Your disappearance will be noted by the local motel in 48 hours, then passed to the sheriff, who is already convinced you are another city fool lost in the woods." He then delivered the chilling purpose of their capture. "You will be held here for 3 weeks. Your vehicle will be moved by our accomplice to a deep section of the forest where it will be found, suggesting you abandoned it on a hike. After 3 weeks, all attention will be diverted. And then your bodies will be found, weeks later, miles away, suggesting you died of exposure and animal consumption. The official narrative must remain the legend." He paused, a cold smile touching his lips. "We don't kill for pleasure, Mr. Thorne. We kill to maintain the narrative of our isolation. And you two are now the final piece of the story." The psychological terror was immense. The Grimsby family was meticulously planning their disposal to ensure their legend remained a legend. The perfect alibi for their continued existence. Their execution would not be a random act of savagery, but a calculated administrative step. Marcus had to find the emotional lever, the weakness in their cold logic. He shouted through the slot, "You don't have to do this. You have an accomplice. You have money. You can leave. You can escape." The father chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Escape? We are not prisoners, Mr. Thorne. We are the survivors. We have our own world here, free from your world's judgment and interference. And thanks to your accomplice, we have the means to keep it that way." The father then locked the wheelbarrow and walked away, leaving them in the suffocating darkness, the sounds of their own impending demise swirling around them. The rest of the night was a silent, agonizing vigil. Marcus and Chloe took turns sleeping, their conversation limited to whispers, their focus now entirely on escape. Marcus had discovered a slight weakness in one of the floor logs, a knot that had been drilled out for ventilation, but it was too small for either of them to squeeze through. The next morning, the heavy wooden door was finally opened. Standing outside was Elias, the thin lookout, and a younger woman, pale and gaunt, carrying 2 bowls of lukewarm, watery stew. They set the food down without a word and locked the door again. The food was meager, but they ate it quickly. Around midday they heard the truck again. The diesel engine, The hiss of the air brakes, the familiar crunch of gravel. The accomplice had returned. Marcus pressed his ear to the wall again. He could hear the father's voice, low and dominant, greeting the accomplice. "The journalists are secured. The narrative is ready," the father stated. A new voice spoke, smooth and surprisingly familiar, the voice of the accomplice. "Good. Did they get a good look at my face?" "They had a camera," the father confirmed. "But the evidence is now ours. The price for the extraction is still $10,000, and you will move the vehicle as agreed." The accomplice sighed. "Always with the threats, father. Don't you ever tire of it?" Marcus's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was Deputy Sheriff Robert "Robbie" Kinsley, the same deputy who had signed off on Marcus's permits to film in the forest, the one who had casually dismissed the Grimsby legend as backwoods nonsense when they first spoke in Fairfax. The pieces slammed together. Deputy Kinsley had access to the records, knew the search patterns, and knew exactly which tourists were coming and going. He was the perfect invisible collaborator. "It is not a threat, Robbie. It is the cost of doing business. You give us the necessary resources and information, and we provide you with silence. The silence that ensures your continued success. 10 years, Robbie. 10 years of service to your community, all built on the certainty that your local problems disappear without a trace." Robbie's voice dropped, laced with bitterness. "I needed the money for my mother's treatment. I told you, I needed a one-time thing. The $10,000 for the first drop was supposed to be the end. And then the salesman disappeared. And the campers. And the money became necessary for your re-election campaigns, didn't it, Deputy? You see, Robbie, the price of silence is paid continuously," the father chided. "We needed to eliminate the evidence of your connection. Them." The full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy was now clear. The deputy sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law, was actively working with the Grimsbys, using the historical legend as a smokescreen to cover the organized disappearances of people who might expose his secret. The $10,000 was the cost of the delivery, the supplies for the Grimsbys, and the disposal, the bodies of the missing. Suddenly, a massive argument erupted outside the cell. "I won't do the final part, Father. I won't move their bodies. I draw the line there," Robbie yelled, his voice cracking. "I supply, I provide cover, but I am not a murderer." "You are already a murderer, Robbie. You gave us the information on the lost campers, didn't you? You told us where they would be," the father said, his voice deceptively calm. "And those journalists, we could simply hand them over to the law. You think they'd believe the backwoods nonsense defense when they hear your voice on the footage?" Marcus realized they had the ultimate leverage, the stolen wildlife camera. If he had managed to retrieve the small device with the images of Robbie's face, the evidence was still out there, hidden. He had tucked it into his pocket and abandoned the laptop, but the small camera was still on his person. He reached into his coat pocket. It was there. The argument escalated. There was a sound of a struggle, a gasp, and then the heavy thud of a body hitting the dirt. The father's voice was triumphant. "You drew the line in the wrong place, Deputy. You should have drawn it before you took the first dollar." Then, the final chilling sound, the heavy metallic click of the bar being lifted from their cell door. The father was coming in, not to kill them, but to retrieve the final necessary piece of evidence, the small wildlife camera. The game was about to reach its violent climax. The cell door swung inward with a screech of rusty hinges. The daylight streamed in, illuminating the father. His face was cold, etched with the certainty of his success. Behind him, Elias stood guard, a rough wooden club held loosely in his hand. "Where is it, Mr. Thorne?" the father demanded, stepping into the cell. "The small camera you took from the logging road. Hand it over and your end will be quick and clean." Marcus stood up, protecting Chloe behind him. He looked directly at the father, choosing his words carefully. "It's not here. We hid it. And Deputy Kinsley?" He wasn't arguing about a few $1,000s. He was arguing about the last missing person, Marcus said, inventing, trying to exploit the only emotional crack he had observed in the Grimsby's cold logic, their self-perception as survivors, not wanton killers. The father froze. "What are you talking about?" "The young woman, the one who brought us the food. She looked ill." "Inbred diseases," Marcus stated, watching the father's expression shift from cold anger to a flicker of profound pain. Robbie wasn't paying for silence. He was paying for medical supplies for his own daughter. "She's one of you, isn't she? The result of the isolation. He was protecting her and you're using her to blackmail him." The shock on the father's face confirmed the stunning realization. The Grimsby bloodline was not simply isolated. It was intermingled with the outside world, and the deputy sheriff was an unwitting participant. He said he wouldn't be a murderer. He knows what happens when the supplies stop. "She dies," Marcus pressed, pushing the psychological knife deeper. "You are forcing a father to choose between his daughter and his badge. That's your business, isn't it? Blackmail and silence." Suddenly, a loud, panicked scream erupted from the settlement courtyard. The voice of the young woman Marcus had seen. It was followed by a crash and the urgent shouts of the Grimsby family members. Elias, the lookout, immediately turned, his focus diverted. "Father, something's wrong." The father, reeling from Marcus's accusation and distracted by the chaos, momentarily lowered his guard. This was the opening. "Now, Chloe!" Marcus yelled. Chloe, having positioned herself by the weak ventilation hole, had been working silently, pushing the small knot of wood out of its socket. As the father turned slightly, Marcus launched himself forward, not toward the father, but toward the wall, smashing his elbow into the weakened spot. The log split with a sharp crack, the impact sending a shower of wood splinters into the father's face. The father roared in pain, dropping his weapon. Elias, already running toward the courtyard, was too far away to help. Marcus grabbed the father's dropped club, and not stopping for a moment, drove his shoulder into the door, bursting past the stunned Elias and into the courtyard. The scene outside was a disaster. The young woman Marcus had seen was lying on the ground, having fallen while carrying a bucket of water. More critically, the commotion had caused a large, stacked pile of dried logs, meant for winter fuel, to shift and collapse against the main fence gate, creating a temporary but significant breach. Marcus grabbed Chloe's hand. "The fence! Run!" They sprinted toward the log pile. The Grimsby family, confused and unorganized, was scrambling to help the fallen woman and assess the damage to the gate. They were momentarily distracted, their cold efficiency broken by the family chaos. Elias finally caught up, swinging his club wildly. Marcus dodged the blow, the club shattering against a loose rock. He pulled Chloe through the narrow gap in the fence logs, not looking back. They ran for their lives, following the line of the fence until they hit the sheer drop into the river gorge. It was a perilous route, but it was the only direction the Grimsbys would not immediately pursue, fearing the treacherous terrain. They scrambled down the steep rocky slope, using the dense scrub brush as handholds, their clothes tearing, their bodies battered. The sound of shouting from the rim of the gorge slowly faded behind them. After an hour of agonizing descent, they reached the riverbank, a place of absolute cold safety. They followed the river for another 2 hours until they finally spotted a small, unmarked trail leading up the far bank toward a public road. Days later, safe in a secure location, Marcus and Chloe delivered the footage and the wildlife camera, containing the images of Deputy Kinsley and the clear GPS coordinates of the hollow, to the FBI. The evidence was irrefutable. The organized criminal conspiracy, the identity of the accomplice, and the location of the hidden community. The FBI raid was quiet, efficient, and precise. The Grimsby family was apprehended. Their isolation had not protected them from the reach of the modern world, only concealed their crimes. Deputy Sheriff Kinsley, arrested at his office, broke down immediately, confessing to everything: the money, the blackmail, the conspiracy of silence, and the continuous supply of people who simply disappeared into the macabre legend. His daughter, protected by her father's desperate actions, was saved. But the cost was a life of profound psychological trauma. The Grimsby legend of 1898 was finally resolved. It was not a story of primitive monsters, but a terrifying account of human calculation, social decay, and the enduring horror of organized crime hiding in the deep, silent woods of America. The true terror was not in the past, but in the present, sustained by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent.